Thank you all for being here on a Friday afternoon. I'll try to do my best not to disappoint. For over 2 decades now, game critics and scholars alike have offered formidable critiques of the gaming industry. Some of this criticism illuminates the hegemony of masculinity, whiteness, and heterosexuality in the gaming milieu, and those social and cultural forces that delimit the ability of women, people of color, and queer people from either entering this industry or feeling comfortable in many of its circles. While these critical voices have grown in number and volume over the years, establishing a prominent place in industry conferences like GDC or on industry websites like Gamasutra, the same problems of workforce and narrative representation continue to persist across the industry. While recent IGDA, International Game Developers Association, surveys indicate women now make up almost 22% of the industry, which is the highest in recorded history, these numbers are still far below representative populations, and the number of people of color and transgender developers remain in the low single digits. However, a generation of people are now directing their critical energies to changing games by example through the development of small games that reflect their own visions and voices, so many of which have never been given shape in the form of a video game. As writer, artist, and game designer Anna Anthropy argues in her book, Rise of the Video Game Zinesters, these amateur game makers are, quote, freaks, normals, amateurs, artists, dreamers, dropouts, queers, housewives, and people like you, who are, according to Anthropy's enthusiastic declarations, taking back an art form. In other words, although video games have become associated with large, corporate-backed, high-profile entertainment products that cater to a masculinized demographic through particular genres like first-person shooters and action-adventure games, so-called amateur developers are approaching games more like personal, creative endeavors. This burgeoning flock of amateurs and artists use cheap or free game development software like Game Maker or Twine, or Visionaire, or Inform 7, or Scratch. There are so many out there that are easy to learn and allow anybody with a computer and some free time to build a digital game or interactive story. In my work, I call these amateur developers everyday developers, since the term everyday, with its unremarkable, almost banal connotations, offers a sharp contrast to the hierarchical language of professionalism that permeates both blockbuster and indie game development, language that seeks to exceptionalize the production of digital games. Moreover, many everyday developed games indeed feature as their topics the minutiae of everyday life, something that amateur game creators have historically looked to for inspiration. Yet, at the same time, as I assert throughout this paper, even as amateur games offer alternative modes of production and play and representation, they necessarily imbricate the mainstream industry in their critiques, illustrating the impossibility of separating the efforts of one from the other. Moreover, in an era where digital labor is increasingly precarious, freelance, and outsourced, everyday developers reflect the workplace practices, routines, and conditions of the formal, dominant games industry through a mirror, darkly, often making tangible the personal anxiety and financial insecurity rampant in the dominant industry, but rarely shared with the public at large for fear of being alienated by a culture that accepts many of the abuses as status quo. Citing Maya Deren's influential essay from 1965, Amateur versus Professional, Broderick Fox reminds us that the Latin roots of amateur refers to an individual who does something for the love of it, not necessarily for commercial or even practical reasons. In his essay, Fox goes on to argue that the identity of amateur is often defined in the negative, not by what qualities describe it, but instead against the qualities of what people consider professional. This method of constructing social and cultural binaries through language for the purpose of domination is a familiar one, and can be seen in any number of examples, including the highbrow, lowbrow in regards to art and culture, I guess with a small c maybe, masculine, feminine in regards to gender, and white, non-white in regards to race. It is no surprise then that all these same hierarchies have, along with the amateur professional, been perpetuated in the industry and culture of gaming as ways of producing and maintaining power for select groups of people. Amateur games built with easy-to-use development tools tend to be small in scale, short in duration, and make use of simple pixel-based graphics. As a consequence of their skill levels, everyday developers largely adopt retro aesthetics, out of necessity, not nostalgia. In this way, they illustrate what Michel Desserteau calls making do, a tactic employed by the powerless in society to use or reuse everyday objects and spaces in subversive, counter-hegemonic ways. In this case, the use of free and available amateur tools by disenfranchised game makers to produce personal games, often with political messages. In many ways, the majority of amateur games might be described as game poems, with the same economy of language and emotional resonance. Okay, that's working. Based out of Oakland, California, Anthropy has made many small games that communicate personal messages or experiences. Dysphoria, an autobiographical game about Anthropy's experiences with hormone replacement therapy, provides an example of the kinds of games that are possible through a robust, everyday developer community. Anthropy designed Dysphoria to unfold over 4 chapters. The first chapter, Gender Bullshit, illustrates a series of events that encouraged her to try hormone replacement therapy, including her negotiations with certain feminist discourses and the feeling of being a spy when entering a woman's bathroom. The second chapter, Medical Bullshit, chronicles her travels through the bureaucracy of the healthcare system. Hormonal Bullshit, the game's third chapter, communicates the trials and tribulations associated with going through the early stages of hormone therapy, including dietary and emotional fluctuations. Dysphoria's final chapter, It Gets Better, with a question mark, notes the small but significant changes to her body and life, while still acknowledging the ongoing social and personal challenges of hormone replacement therapy. Dysphoria uses abstract pixel-based art, colored dominantly with solid purples and greens, alongside simple arrow-based controls across its dozen or so mini-games, mapping Anthropy's journey. One moment, the player struggles to fit a Tetris-like block shape through an impossible opening. The next moment, she navigates a shield up and down on the screen, trying to block the accusations of those who doubt her status as a woman. Every few seconds, the game scenario shifts, jolting the player from one emotional moment to the next, asking her to think quickly and adapt. The rapid pacing and sudden jumps in Dysphoria disorient the player, reinforcing the game's themes of confusion, struggle, and self-doubt. Yet none of the scenarios are meant to be challenging from a mechanical perspective. The controls are always one of 4 arrow directions, and the goal of each screen, if there is one, is to communicate one aspect of Anthropy's experience through rote, almost banal player actions. In fact, some screens merely ask the player to wait, a kind of strange agony in traditional video games, which privilege direct action and manipulation of the game world over stillness and contemplation. The end result of these design decisions is a 6 to 10 minute interactive journey, a digital narrative, the video game version of poetry or personal essay. It's a game that could almost certainly never exist in the commercial games industry, but one that matters as much as or more than the latest Grand Theft Auto or Call of Duty. Of course, other prominent amateur game makers produce work that is just as remarkable, strange, poignant, and alluring. Christine Love, Merritt Kopas, Robert Yang, Hytham Anasser, and Maddie Bryce are just a few of the well-known everyday developers out there, many of whom have even taught themselves to code games after initially experimenting with tools like GameMaker or Twine. Maddie Bryce used a program called RPG Maker to make her game My Nietzsche, a short game about meeting a friend for coffee that also explores gender identity. Appropriately for my concept of the everyday developer, My Nietzsche translates to everyday in Japanese, a title fitting for the everyday activities the player performs in this short game, and the everyday struggles transgender individuals face when confronted by a society that obsessively reads and writes gender and sexuality onto every body. Hence, everyday developer refers not only to the way game production fits into people's everyday lives, but also the way the everyday informs the content and execution of these games. Yet as everyday creations without formal avenues of distribution, most amateur games unfortunately go undiscovered and unplayed. Getting an audience is not impossible, but it takes dedicated public outreach, perpetual self-branding, and an online presence most amateur developers do not have time for. Nancy Boehm has described this work as the relational labor of connection, an additional and essential form of labor for amateur and indie content creators. For those that do have the time and resources to cultivate a following, Many find audiences and exposure on social media or at alternative game festivals and conferences like Indiecade, Different Games, Lost Levels, and the Game Loop Unconference. Other ways of distributing and gaining exposure for everyday developed games include getting on dedicated archiving sites like Glorious Trainwrecks, Game Jolt, or Forest Ambassadors. Fortunately, most everyday developed game titles are fairly accessible and free once discovered. While some everyday developers do charge a small fee for the download of their games, these minimal payments go a long way in supporting the designer. In his analysis of amateur Japanese RPG makers, Kenji Ito argues that for amateurs to be successful, all they require are accessible creation software and a nurturing community of peers. However, what many everyday developers need in addition to accessible software and community support is a means of economic survival. While most amateur developers have no desire to join the formal networks of the games industry, some nonetheless would like to earn a living based on their creations, at least enough to pay for food, rent, and the opportunity to create another game project. These are very real costs, and as such, in addition to charging nominal fees for game downloads, several prominent amateur developers have started to use crowdfunding options like Patreon to pay bills. In many ways, these smaller developers reflect the structural failures of the larger, formalized industry on an intimate level, not to mention the general decline in working conditions across the media industries, where the problems of precarity and flexibility loom large. Despite not being skilled in programming languages or advanced game creation toolsets, everyday developers nonetheless create digital games, taking advantage of user-friendly software that aid in the game creation process by streamlining most of the back-end operations and offering flexible templates and options for game production. As Anthropy argues, quote, games from hobbyists have the potential to change the dominant format of the video game. Instead of 70-hour, multi-million-dollar games that sell for $60 a piece, digital games can be short and self-contained, less than an hour, short enough to fit comfortably into an adult player's day, unquote. Amateur games, then, are the games of the everyday, built in the context of the everyday, and often featuring everyday experiences. Yet despite my scholarly enthusiasm, I am not trying to argue that game development and distribution are now magically democratized, revealing an infinitely robust marketplace where anybody who wants to can build games and make even the semblance of a living off of them. This is decidedly not the case. Additionally, while I focus on marginalized everyday development practices as one avenue of progressive change for the medium of digital games, I would like to join Adrienne Shaw in her criticism of those that argue that this is the only front on which feminist and social critics should be battling. As Shaw asserts, one theme in the discourse around representational equality in gaming is the demand that marginalized peoples become developers themselves and create the games and the change that they want. In addition to being an unfair burden on marginalized people, letting those who currently have power to change things off the hook, this argument also ignores structural inequalities in the production and distribution of games. As Shaw writes, quote, it is not an inherently bad thing to encourage more people to use the tools available to them to make their own games. However, to pretend that there are no structural inequalities in who gets to make games, even indie games, is very short-sighted, unquote. Therefore, even as we must pay attention to and encourage game development on the borders of the gaming industry, we must not stop pushing for the industry itself to do better. Change within the dominant industry is difficult and slow-going, but it is still worth pursuing, especially because it is the place where such critiques are needed the most. Thank you.